talking about this topic of doomed to repeat, and we've been seeing that the nation of Israel keeps falling back into the same patterns again and again and again. Can anybody identify with that? We have these great expectations and goals and desires, but at the end of the day, somebody like, I don't know, maybe George shows up with these mega double stuffed Oreo cookies, and you're like, George, I don't want to eat. This is all hypothetical. I don't want to eat Oreo cookies, George. He's like, but Pastor, I love you so much, I brought them for you. And you're doomed to repeat that cycle of eating those Oreo cookies again and again. Can anybody identify with that? And we see that God keeps saying this refrain over and over. If you will obey my commands and decrees, it will go well for you. You will be blessed. And so what we've been doing is we've started at the end of the story a couple of weeks ago, and we're actually going backwards through the story of Israel. We started in the Promised Land. They were just about to go and take Jericho, and God speaks to them in week 1. And in week 1, we talked about setting God-sized goal. And in order to set God-sized goal, first of all, we have God-sized goal, excuse me. In order to set God-sized goal, first of all, we have to be detailed. What is it that we want to accomplish? What is it that we want to do? We have to be detailed about those goals. Secondly, we need to go public with those goals, we said a couple of weeks ago. We said that if we're going to set God-sized goals and we're going to break the cycle, we're not going to be doomed to repeat the same cycle again and again, then you know what? We need to talk to somebody about it. We need to bring somebody in. We need to be accountable for that goal. And then lastly, we said that in order to break that cycle in our lives, we have to review that goal regularly. It's not just going to happen. We have to constantly come back and review and recheck and make sure and measure ourselves against that. And then in week 2, we talked about getting the right start. So here they were. Now we backed up farther into the story, and it's before they even crossed the Jordan River. And God stops again, and he says, listen, if you will obey my decrees and my commands, you will be blessed. There's blessing in obedience. And so Moses says to the people of Israel, says, listen, stop for a second. The first thing you need to know about God's regulations and decrees is that they're not difficult. They're already written in your heart. You kind of already know that what God's saying makes sense. So they're not difficult to obey if you really stop and consider them. And then he says this to the people of Israel. He says, the choice is yours, though. You will decide today. Blessings or curses. The choice is yours, what you will choose. Will you choose blessings in your life? Blessings comes from obedience, and curses comes from the results or the consequences of our not obeying God. And then he follows up that by saying, but if you will choose to follow God's commands and decrees, you will prosper. You will be blessed. There is blessing in obedience. And last week we talked about this. We talked about suffering. We talked about suffering through that. There's times in our lives when here they are, we go farther back, they're in the desert, and they're like, we don't like the desert. We don't like where we're at. We don't like what's happening. And God says, yeah, but you've got to go through the desert. You've got to go through suffering in order to experience the promise. You've got to go through the difficult times. You've got to go through the trials. Sometimes you can't skirt around it. The lesson is in the suffering. The blessing comes at the end of the trial. And so we talked about that God is with us in those times. And we talked about the fact that sometimes we want to get out of suffering, but God is in suffering. And when we get ourselves out of it, sometimes we're worse off because God's not in the out. God is in the suffering. He's in the trial. He's with us. And in order to have God with us, we've got to go through that situation. So we said in order to do that, first of all, we have to check our heart. Is God in control or am I in control? What's my motivation? What do I really long for? Am I going after God or do I just want comfort? Not only do we check our hearts, we need to check or watch our egos, I said last week. See, it's actually easier to be close to God in the tough times because we need Him. But what about the good times? God's in the good times too. And God's watching and challenging and checking us in the good times. He wants to know our heart. Is he getting the glory in the good times, or are we taking the credit for the good times? And then we followed up, we ended last week by saying we've got to let God be God. Too often, we want to jump in and we want to take control of the situation because we don't like the situation. Let's be honest. Nobody here is signing up for suffering. Not one of us, including me. But you know what? We have to let God be God. So today, we're going to talk about 5 to 1. That's going to make sense in just a few moments. We're talking about 5 to 1. Now, I have to start today's message by saying, I don't know how God does it. I don't know how God is patient with mankind, because I would wipe us out. On my best day, I'd wipe us out, right? And I'm going to share with you one of, if not the most infuriating stories in all of Scripture today. Now, again, we're going farther back into the story of Israel. They are in the desert, and this is God's first attempt, the story that we're going to tell today. This is God's first attempt to get the people of Israel into the promised land. And we're going to find out that it does not go well. As a matter of fact, this is what we would call a major setback. A major setback for the people of Israel. But God's plans are going to be fulfilled. So we're going to talk, and I'm going to take us through the story of Numbers chapter 13 and 14. We're not going to read the whole text because of length today, but I'm going to tell you the story, and we'll pull a couple of verses out of it as we go along. So here we are. It's Numbers chapter 13 and 14. And like I said, Israelites, they're in the desert. They're right there. And so what God does is he tells Moses to send out 12 spies. He says, take one spy from every one of the 12 tribes, and they're going to go into the land of Canaan, and they're going to spy on it, and they're going to bring a report back and tell the people of Israel about the land that I have given to you. So they head out, they go out into the promised land. But just before they do, I want you to read with me the very last part of Numbers chapter 1 and verse 2. And here's what it says. The Lord said to Moses, send out men to explore the land of Canaan, the land that I am giving to the Israelites. Everybody say giving. Now, we need full participation here. You ready? Everybody say giving. That's important. I'm giving the land of Canaan to the people of Israel. Anybody here ever receive a gift? Right? How many of you have ever had to do something for a gift? If somebody's given it to you, you just get it, right? Isn't that what God says here? I'm giving you the land of Israel. In other words, the land was theirs to take. God had already taken care of it. He had already given it to them. It was his possession to hand over to them. So these 12 spies go out and they check out the land, and when they come back, here's what they report. They report, first of all, that the land was exactly what they hoped it would be. The location was perfect, and that everything they needed or wanted was provided for them in that land. They're like, this place is awesome. As a matter of fact, they use this term that's really kind of odd if you think about it. They're like, this land is so prosperous, this land is so rich that it flows with milk and honey. Anybody here raise your kids on VeggieTales? Right? Every time I hear that now, what do you say? It flows with milk and honey. Nobody? Ooh, gross. You didn't raise your kids on VeggieTales. You are posers. Stop. Like, think about it. Like, milk and honey just flows there. Like, okay. But their point was, this land is so fertile. This land produces so much crop and has so many good things. It's just flowing. It's just everywhere. You can get what you need here. So they come back after this 40 days and they begin to give this report. And all 12 of the spies agreed that the location was ideal. But 10 of the 12 spies said that it was impossible for them to take possession of the land because the people in Canaan were too strong and they were too powerful. There was no way that they would be able to overtake them. As a matter of fact, they said these words. They said, "We looked like grasshoppers in their sight." They are so big, they are so formidable that we look as insignificant to them as bugs. Think about that. Now let's go back to verse 2. What did God say? Thank you. One person was listening to me. I'm giving you the land. I already possess it. It's mine to give. You don't have to take anything. I'm giving what is mine to you. But these 10, they report that there's no way they can do it. It's impossible. But there was two guys out of the 10, Joshua and Caleb. And they're like, whoa. What do you mean it's impossible? Is God not in this? Did God not say it was ours already? Did God not send us to the land? What are you talking about? It's impossible. And so Caleb, he speaks up. I love Caleb. You're going to find, if you read through the story of Israel, you're going to find Caleb shows up 40 years later. He's an 80-year-old man, and they're passing out the land. And Caleb says, I want the hill country. The hill country was the hardest part. That's where the biggest, the most formidable enemy lived. That's the land at 80 years old that Caleb wanted. This guy is hardcore. And Caleb says this in verse 30. He says, let's go at once and take the land. We can certainly conquer it. It's ours. What are we waiting for? Why are we talking about this? We're wasting time. The land is already ours. God has given it to us. See, he believed that if God was sending them, that God would provide for them. He knew that if God was in it, God would make a way. He knew that if it was God's will, God pays the bill. And he said, what are we waiting for? We're wasting time. I want my house. I'm tired of living in a tent. I'm tired of living in the desert. I want to be where God has already told us we should be. God's already promised it to us. What are we waiting for? He believed that no one and nothing could stop them because God was on their side. But there was 10 guys, 10 out of 12, who said it was impossible. And so here's what they did. Those 10 guys went back to their tribes, and they began to have town meetings. Well, guys, it was really nice. You should have seen the grapes there. The grapes were huge. Milk, honey, flowing everywhere. It was the craziest thing I've ever seen. This place is nuts. But it's never going to happen. It's not going to happen. It's impossible. You should see the size of the people there. You should see the size of the walls that they've built around the cities. This place is impossible. It's not going to happen. I'm sorry. I wish I could give you a better outlook on it, but it's not going to happen. And so within 24 hours, they form a mob. Within 24 hours, they'd been in the land. 24 hours later, they form a mob, and they're ready to kill Joshua and Caleb. And of course, you ready? The Israelites say the line that they always come back to. Wasn't it better for us when we were back in Egypt? How many of you are old enough to remember Keith Green's So You Want to Go Back to Egypt? Anybody old enough? Oh, it's good stuff. If you're not, that's a great song. Go back and listen to that song, all you kids. Us old people, we had good music. Am I lying here? Of course, we all say that. Our music stunk too, okay? But that's a good song. That's a really good. So you want to go back to Egypt, okay? And let's go back to Egypt. It's better off being slaves. Think about that. They wanted to go back where God had taken them out of. And so listen, God had had enough. God's patience had been worn out. God has enough. And here's what God does. He comes to Moses, and he says to Moses, here's what I'm going to do. I'm wiping out the people of Israel, and I'm going to start a new nation with you. Now, I don't know about you, but I would have been like, the Alanites? I like it. Yes, Let's do this. Now we got a good plan. I like this, God, right? I've never got why Moses didn't take God up on it. But here's what Moses says. Moses says, listen, God, you could have done that and left the people of Israel in Egypt. You could have made a great nation out of me and forgot about them all along. That's never been your plan. And if you wipe them out, what's that going to say to the other nations? That God's strong enough to take them out of slavery, but you're not strong enough to get them to the promised land? It's not a good message, God. Now, do you think Moses actually talked God out of it? Of course not. I believe that was a test for Moses' heart. Because God knew. God wasn't going to take people out of Israel, out of Egypt and just, not fulfill his promise. But he wanted to see Moses' heart at that point. And Moses passes the test. He says, God, this isn't a good idea. So God says, okay. But these folks, they're not going into the promised land. And so God spares the people, but he sends them back into the desert. God sends them back into the desert. He sends them back into the desert, and why does he send them back into the desert? He sends them back into the desert to die. Anybody 20 years old and older is going to die in the wilderness. It's going to die in the desert. And their children would be recipients of God's blessing. God had enough. See, Israel's constant lack of faith and disobedience had finally caught up to them. Have you ever been there? Your kids, they whine one time too many. You're like, no dinner, go to your room. Go to your room. You don't want to go to the next. You ever been like you do not want to know what the next level is? Ever been there? That's good preaching. Oh, come on, be honest, you've been there, right? That person who works for you, they've come in late for the 21st time, and you're like, no more job. You've had enough. You've broken through. You've crossed the line. My patience is done. There's that friend, right? That person who says they're your friend, but they talk about you behind your back. One time too many, and you're just like, you know what? I don't need this in my life. It's time for me to upgrade. We've been there. We've had enough. And God was in that position where he had enough. It was too much, too often, and God finally reached his breaking point. The Gottman Institute, they do scientific studies, and here's what they did. They started looking at relationships. They started looking at marriages, and they found with a 90% accuracy rate, they found this. They found what the key is to successful and happy marriages versus marriages that aren't happy, aren't successful, aren't healthy. Here's what they found. They find that there has to be an even greater number of positive interaction versus negative interaction. And that ratio, you ready, is 5 to 1. In other words, they're not saying that there isn't ever negativity in marriages, because there's going to be, right? If you live with somebody, it's going to happen. Too many people looking at me going, right? We know that. Okay? This isn't new. But what they found is that if you will speak life and health and good things into your relationship 5 times to 1, you're going to be in a healthy relationship. Every relationship, even our relationship with God, has to have these positive reinforcement and interactions. Every relationship, even our relationship with God, can I tell you something? It has a breaking point. Now, that doesn't mean that God doesn't love us. That doesn't mean that God's grace isn't sufficient. Doesn't mean that God throws us out or kicks us out or turns his back on us. That's not what I'm saying. And even though God's grace makes up for our weaknesses, here's what I want you to catch this morning. God still cares about the words that we say about him and the words that we say to him. Our negative to positive ratio with God is important. And what that means is this. It means that when we grumble and we complain against God, and when we doubt God's motives, his heart, his plans, and we don't take him seriously, God is listening. And God had had enough of providing for Israel just to have them doubt him. Think about this. Think about this. These same guys who are saying that God could not provide for them and take them into the promised land, they're the same guys who had gone out that morning and food had fallen from the sky for them. That morning. Think about that. These guys who said that God couldn't take care of them and take them into the promised land could look up and see a cloud that was leading them every single day. And at night, they could look up and see a ball of fire that led them every single day. These were the same guys who'd been out in the wilderness and they had run out of water, and Moses took a stick and he hit the rock. And think about how many of you have ever thought about that for a second? If you've read that story, he hits the rock and water starts coming out, right? How many of you in your mind you see like a spring of water coming out? You know, it's a little spring of water and everybody comes with their bucket and fills it up. Come on, raise your hand if that's the way you look at it. My pastor in Brookfield, he had a picture of what it must have really looked like. It was a huge rock, and out of it, there was a river of water. It was 1 million people. It couldn't have been just a little bitty thing of water. It had to be a torrent of water to water not only 1 million plus people, but their animals as well. So these guys had seen this happen, and they still did not trust that God would take them into the promised land. Are you kidding me? It's like, it boggles the mind, doesn't it? But I wonder this morning how many miraculous things we see in our lives every single day, and we still doubt God. We still don't trust that God will provide for us. We still don't trust that God will take care of us. We still don't trust that God has it all under control. I mean, think about this. Think about this right here. Anybody ever see Back to the Future, the movie Back to the Future, right? And that was 80s technology. Could you imagine if you went back to just the 50s with your phone? You would be a sorcerer. I mean, literally, people would line up to touch and see your phone. Like, dude, you can watch whole episodes of TV at the same day? That's like far out, man. The miracles we see every day in our life. If you've never seen a miracle, I want to take you to the hospital. Miracles every day. I just saw a report that they went in and they did surgery on a baby before it was born for spinal bifida. And that baby was born healthy. God, we see the miraculous every single day, and yet we doubt God. And so here's what Israel does. God says, you're going back to the desert, boys. You just won yourself a one-way trip back to the desert. And what does Israel do? What do? They do what every single one of us would have done. We're so sorry, God, we repent. Oh, we're horrible. Right? See, they repented after the fact. After God had had enough. After they had run out. They ran God's patience. Think about that. To the end. They weren't sorry for the lack of faith. They weren't sorry about their disobedience. You know what they were sorry for? the consequences. They were sorry for the consequences. They weren't at all sorry for what they had done, but they were sorry that they got caught and that God called them out on it. How like Israel are we? As I was preparing this sermon, there was a couple times I just had to get on my face. God, I'm just like them. See, the real problem was that they rebelled against God. See, God had already promised the land to them. Think about that. It was theirs. Go, I'm giving it to you. And then he told them to go. I mean, what else did they need? What else did they need? But they doubted and they disobeyed. You know what they had? I didn't put this in your notes, but I'd really recommend writing this down. They had what I call a grasshopper mentality. We saw ourselves as grasshoppers. They saw us as grasshoppers. The enemy's too great. And they rebelled against God. Listen, they rebelled against God because they forgot how big God is. The problem, the enemy, the situation, the circumstance became bigger than God. In your notes this morning, they were more afraid of their enemy than they were confident in their God. How many times am I guilty of that? I'm more afraid of the circumstance. I'm more afraid of the situation. I'm more afraid of stepping out. I'm more afraid of my enemy than I am confident in my God. This is why God was upset with them. He was tired of proving himself to them. God said, I've had enough. I'll work through your kids. How in the world could I take you out of slavery? Walk through the sea on dry ground. Drop food every day for you. It even says in this portion of scriptures that their sandals did not wear out and their feet never got blisters. Fire by night, cloud by day. What else do I have to do to prove myself to you? You all can go to the desert and die. Your children will see the fulfillment of my promise because my promise stands sure. I will bless the nations through this people, but it won't be with you. Can I tell you something? This may be a news flash. God has feelings. You and I were created in the image of God. God has feelings. God is joyful. God sorrows. God gets angry. And God gets frustrated. Here's the deal. Fear literally paralyzed the people of Israel. And if we'll let it have a foothold in our lives, it will steal God's promises from us. Let me say that again. If you will allow fear to take a foothold in your life, it will steal, it will rob God's promises for your life. So I'm going to ask you 3 questions this morning. I'll move as quickly as I can. You with me? First question this morning is this. What is the Canaan land opportunity that God has placed before you today? What's an opportunity that God has given to you? It may just be a dream right now. Can I tell you something? God's put that dream in your heart for a reason. It may just be a wish. If I could just do. Can I tell you something? God's put that in your heart for a reason. Man, if I had the ability, if I had the guts to, I would just, right? Maybe it's a new career. Maybe it's relocating. Can I tell you something? One of the ones I watch more than anything else, going after God rather than having to have somebody else in your life. Here's what I mean by that. I watch so many people that are so afraid of being alone, they'll suffer with anybody just instead of being alone. So they go from bad relationship to bad relationship to bad relationship. And can I tell you something? God's saying, if you would just focus on me, I'll take care of it. That's a big trust. But God, I don't like being alone. But God, I see everybody else. They seem so happy. But God, I'll take a bad relationship rather than a good relationship because I don't trust you to provide someone for me that will draw me closer to you rather than leaving me empty and worthless and feeling abandoned. That's a big trust. Maybe for you it's going back to school or getting out of debt or getting engaged or starting a family. Maybe for some of us it's going into ministry. You say, well, I've got a good job, but did God's put it in your heart to be in ministry? You go, but I'd have to give up. God goes, yep, you have to trust me. For others, it might just be buying a house, and you're just paralyzed with fear. There's some of you, becoming a regular giver is a huge step of faith for you. Becoming a regular giver, you go, Others, it's going on a missions trip. You know, I could afford it, I could do it, but I'm scared. Or volunteering in a ministry. These are all things that are good things that God puts on our heart, and we just allow fear to paralyze us. Second question for you this morning is this. What is the Canaan land opportunity that God is placing before you? I'm sorry, what is the Canaan land? Where are you at? There we go. What's the Canaanite, there it is, opposition that is causing you to hesitate? What's the opposition? What do you look at and go, that's too big, that's too great? What's the Canaanite opposition that causes you to hesitate? It's too big. How about this one? I'm not worthy. I'm not capable. Yeah, maybe you're not capable yet. But if God calls you to it, guess what He'll do? He'll provide for you. You'll become capable. What do you think? People just stand up in front of churches like we're born pastors? None of us are. God builds and builds and builds. What's that thing that's causing you to hesitate? How about this one? It's never been done before. That's why He's calling you. They don't like me. Nobody gets it. Of course they don't get it. God's given you the dream. Never get it until somebody shows them. I don't have funding. I need people. I need a team. God says, I'll provide. How about this? We don't have any space to do it. And we wonder, God, how are you going to do it? And God says, I've put the dream in your heart. Let me provide. Some of us, we worry about the fact that nobody in our family's ever gone to college. I'm afraid of being alone. What if I fail? They'll laugh at me. I'll prove the doubters right. Yeah, but you could prove the doubters wrong. 50-50. I just can't get started. What's the Canaanite opposition? See, what's the common denominator in everything I just said? Fear. Fear. Can I tell you something? There's so many people, they go, Satan's attacking me, Satan's attacking me. Satan doesn't have to attack most people. He just lets fear do it. Like Satan doesn't have to show up at your house. He just has to send fear. We get gripped by it. I've never seen a time in my life where so many people have anxiety and fear and depression. Satan, it's his greatest tool. And the only way we overcome fear is with faith. The only way we overcome fear is with obedience. We got to step out. And because of fear, Israel rebelled against God. And the result of Israelites' rebellion and unbelief is that they suffered the consequences of it. God said, listen, I can't do this through you. I can't possibly give you any other way to see that I'm capable. I'm going to have to do it through the next generation. They missed out. They missed out. They missed out on God's best because they let fear dominate their lives. And they were prohibited from going into the promised land. See, they were doomed to keep circling around in the desert for the next 40 years until they died and the next generation could enter. Every time I read that, I think of Lampoon's European Vacation. You remember that? It looked like this.
Circle here should be the second left exit. There's the hotel. Hey, look, kids! There's Big Ben and there's Parliament.
There it is, there it is, there it is.
I know. I can't seem to get over to the left, honey. I'll try next time. Sorry. We'll get out of this jam in a minute. Kids, Big Ben, Parliament again. Kids,
We know, Big Ben.
Parliament. Look, kids, forget it. It's amazing. I cannot get left. There's Big Ben, kids, Parliament. I don't know.
I think for 40 years, Big Ben, Parliament. As the worship team comes. Third question for you this morning is this. Will you embrace the Caleb option in the face of the challenge? Will you embrace the Caleb option? We can do this. God is with us. It's already ours. It's been given to us. What are we waiting for? Let's go at once to take the land. We can certainly conquer it. I love Caleb. I don't care what anybody else thinks. I don't care what they say. We can do this. See, they were doomed to repeat their time in the wilderness because they chose fear over obedience. Here's what God says, just obey me. I'll take care of the rest. Caleb trusted God more than what everybody else's eyes could see. Caleb trusted God more than the report of the other 10 spies. Caleb knew that God's promises could be trusted. See, Caleb didn't have to pray about it. Caleb didn't have to grab a strategic meeting. Let's all get together and go through. Let's make a list of all the positives and all the negatives. It's okay, it's just water. He didn't have to do any of that. He didn't second guess God. He just said, let's go. And here's what happened. Here's what happened. Those Israelites, they go out into the desert. They go back into the desert, and guess what happens? Every single person except 2 died. They buried an entire generation of Israelites out in the desert. 2 guys went into the promised land. Joshua and Caleb. Why? Because they trusted God. They believed God. They knew that God's word was enough. They didn't let fear steal their faith. So I wonder this morning, is fear dominating your life? Is fear dominating your life when you think about God's promises, when you think about stepping out, when you think about doing that thing that's in your heart that God's given to you? We say, well, Pastor Paul, it's not real big. It doesn't matter. It's not the point. The point isn't the size. The point is, what's God saying to you? What's God calling you to do? What's God instructing you to do? Is fear dominating your life? Is fear stealing your vision? Maybe you say, you know what, 20 years ago I had this dream, I had this idea, I thought that God was calling me, I thought that God, and you allow fear and you think that the vision is dead because you've allowed fear to dominate and steal it from you for so long, and you think, well, you know what, it's too late. If you stop and you think about it, it's still right there. Yeah, but I don't know what my spouse, I don't know what my kids, I don't know what my boss, I don't know what my family, I don't know. And then that brings us to the last question. Does fear dominate your life or obedience? Do you operate in fear or do you operate in obedience? God says do it. Okay. People go, how are you going to do it? I don't know. I just know that God said to do it, so that's good enough for me. What's it going to look like? Don't know. All I know is God said I could do it. When? Now. Why? Because God said no. Go. Here's what 1 John chapter 4, verse 18 says. It says, love has no fear. Because perfect love expels fear. If we're afraid, it is for fear of punishment. And this shows that we have not fully experienced his perfect love. Can I tell you this morning? The reason fear is clouding your judgment, the reason fear is dominating your life, listen, it's because you've not fully pressed in. You have your eyes on everything else, not on God. But the circumstances, remember the story? Peter jumps out of the boat. Jesus says, come on out of the water. Walk on the water with me. And Peter's like, okay, sounds good. I love this story because Peter just jumps out of the boat. Hello. He starts walking. What Scripture says, as long as he kept his eye on Jesus, he's walking on water. All of a sudden, that's what I love about Peter. All of a sudden, Peter realizes it's raining and there's a storm going on. He's already jumped out of the boat. And he takes his eyes off of Jesus. And he puts his eyes on the winds and the waves. And he starts to sink. You want to know why you're so scared? You have your eyes on all the winds and the waves. And you're not focused on Jesus. It's kind of hard, Pastor. What can I tell you? But I'd have to give up. I'd have to sacrifice. I'd have to, yep. But you'll never, ever have the fullness that lay your head on your pillow and know the absolute joy of being in God's will. So I'm going to ask you to stand this morning. We're going to sing this song. We introduced it this morning, Sinking Deep. And I'm going to come back. I want you, during this song, I want you just to begin to pray. I'm going to come back and we're going to pray together. While Lindsay leads this song, I want you to say, God, don't even focus on the words necessarily. Don't even focus. Just focus on Jesus right now. Can we shut these lights down? Just the stage lights. Thank you. That's how private a moment I want you to have right now. God, I've allowed, you put it in there. I've allowed what people think. I've allowed what people said. I've allowed my fear. I've allowed doubt. I've allowed the reports. I've allowed to steal away your purpose for my life. And then we'll come back together.